Hi, Meeting House Alliston, and thanks for checking out this week's update video. I was planning on going on another walk for this video, but then I looked outside and saw that it was snowing. So you'll just have to put up with my backdrop being my books and me sitting in my office. Anyway, here are two things that I've been reflecting on this week. Number one, Jesus people. We are going to continue with the theme of highlighting Jesus people within our community who are extending God's grace and peace to their neighbors and their friends and their family during this time. And for this video, I want to highlight you. So many of you responded to the ask that was sent out by the Compassion team to bring in certain donations for Out of the Cold. And you responded so well. And we had the opportunity of dropping those donations off and just seeing the joy on not only the volunteers' faces, but also the guests. The guests were thrilled with getting all of the goodies that were sent, especially the chips. So whoever sent the chips, you can pat yourself on the back. Well done, so good. Thank you for extending joy in this season, and continue to pray for the volunteers at Out of the Cold as they are going far beyond what they typically do. So pray that they have strength, that they sense God's presence, and that they're able to really leverage this situation to bring the love and the peace of Christ to those that they are interacting with. Number two, John chapter 21. John chapter 21 is John's epilogue to his gospel story, his biography about Jesus, and I've been reflecting on John chapter 21 for the last few days. And so what I want us to do is just allow this story to impact us, allow this story to stir our imagination, and maybe it can draw some parallels and analogies for our own life. Before we look at John chapter 21, I want us to look at John chapter 20 because that's the context and the lead up. In John chapter 20, we see Jesus raised from the dead. It's big, it's bold, and it's beautiful. It's what we just celebrated this past week. And with this resurrection, Jesus then goes and encounters his disciples. And this dialogue with the disciples is capped off and it's highlighted by Jesus doing this wacky thing that Danielle touched on when she gave the message on Sunday. He breathes on his disciples. And what it's supposed to do is supposed to jog our memory to Genesis chapter 2, where God breathes into the dust. He breathes life into humanity. And so if that was creation number one, Jesus breathing on his disciples is creation 2.0. It is Jesus creating this new humanity, this new way of being human. And it's a powerful, powerful, powerful thing that's packed with meaning. And then Jesus sends out his disciples. And then we have an interaction between Jesus and Thomas, which is very beautiful. And then the gospel kind of ends. But then John chapter 21 happens. And it's clear from John chapter 21 that the disciples have been sitting around, waiting and wondering, what's next, Jesus? And out of this, we get this really funny story where Peter just seems to pop up from hanging out with the disciples and says, I'm going fishing. And he goes and starts to fish, and the disciples are like, okay, we'll go too, Peter. And they go and fish, and they're fishing all night long, and they catch nothing. And then all of a sudden, we're introduced to this figure on the beach who calls out to them and says, throw your net to the right side. And so they do. They throw the net onto the right side, and they catch so much fish. And it's wonderful, and they're trying to figure out who is this guy who has the ability to do this. And then, of course, it takes John, the disciple that Jesus loved, to say, you know what, it's probably the Lord. And so Peter then throws off some clothes and runs in the water. It's quite the picture. And he runs to Jesus and he sees that Jesus has made a meal for them, bread and fish. And I want to take just two takeaways from this. First, in this time of wondering and waiting, Peter reveals something that's very true about the human nature, that we fall back on things that we're familiar with in times of waiting and in times of wondering. What's going to be next? For Peter, it is fishing. Peter was a fisherman, and so he goes and fishes. And for us, we need to realize that sometimes falling back on what we know, it can be very helpful. and healthy, or it can be very harmful and unhealthy. It's true that God calls us to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be, and we're constantly battling temptation, the desire to be pulled into a lesser version of ourselves. And this is just a reminder, a friendly reminder to say, if you are being tempted to fall back on things that are not healthy, that are actually harmful, reach out to someone. This is sort of a petri dish of temptation, in which the time in which we live, it really is. It has all the ingredients for temptation stew. And so again, just to say, let's not fall back on bad habits, but let's continue to reach out and journey together to stir us towards good habits. The second thing that I want to just to bring out and to allow us to sit in is both the miracle and the meal that Jesus provides. For the miracle, Jesus obviously does something miraculous when he tells the disciples to put the net onto the right side and it fills up with fish. And this is to speak to the disciples to say, listen, I am with you. Even though I'm about to leave, I am with you and I will provide. The same power that raised me from the dead, the same power that I showed walking on earth and being with you is now for you, and it's invested in your good. And the meal for Jesus is this beautiful way of saying the last picture that I want you to see of me is us having a meal. And I'm sure as the disciples sat down to eat with Jesus, certain words and phrases and sentences that Jesus said would come to mind. I think of the words in John chapter 14 and John chapter 15, where in John chapter 14, Jesus says to his disciples, I'm not going to leave you as orphans. I will be with you. I will come back. And in John chapter 15, he says, I no longer see you as servants or slaves. I see you as friends. I no longer regard you as people just to learn from and sort of lesser than, but now you're my companions. And so by meeting together and by having a meal for this last send-off, we are rooted in this communion with Jesus. And so I hope that during this time, this wacky season that we find ourselves in, that you're able to rest in both the miracle, the provision of Jesus, but also the communion, the fellowship, the fact that Jesus is spreading a table and providing for you bread and fish. All right, friends, I hope this was encouraging to you, and hopefully next week I get to go on a walk and you'll be able to join me. Right now, have a great week. Grace and peace to you.